Okay. My background is in running research programs in support of campaigns aimed at countering the spread of violent extremism online. It's maybe a bit of an odd and specialist area to have stumbled into from originally philosophy and ethics, but I clearly remember my introduction to hate speech aged around 10 years old. I'm Austrian, and one half of my family is Jewish in ancestry, and some members of the other side had some unfortunate Nazi associations. And I was learning about the Holocaust for the first time, discussing it at home, and really vividly remember my father pulling out a piece of paper, drawing a swastika, while the whole time explaining that what he was doing was highly illegal. Which is sort of exciting when you're 10 years old. And then ripping up and destroying, he destroyed that piece of paper. I think that cuts to the core of a question that many of us here today grapple with on a daily basis. We've heard from Kate talk about video games and Akil about groups and communities. What should we be free to express in public, and what actually needs to be censored? Danny's a software engineer. He was the tech lead at Moonshot CVE, which is where we met in early 2018. And we quickly learned we're passionate about developing creative and new technical solutions to help counter online harms, and spent 2 years at Sulis Insights developing a number of tools to help us learn as much as we could about various online communities disseminating mis and disinformation and violent extremist materials. What I'd like to tell you about today is a project that we've been working on for the past year. What we've been seeing was that in response to actions taken both by governments and social media companies, various online communities fragmented. They moved to more hidden, harder to reach corners of the internet. So in some ways that's, of course, a huge success, but it made tracking and monitoring those groups and actors a lot more difficult and time intensive. So that was a problem for researchers and practitioners working across academic institutions, think tanks, across private companies and government. I'm sure some of you will know this firsthand. One thing in particular that we kept seeing come up were reports warning specifically of a threat that some groups and actors, some hostile groups and actors might be pushed to the dark web. And generally, this was sort of in the space that we were working in, sort of quite vague description of what that actually meant. It was discussed as a black hole of information, an inaccessible space. We saw, so Joshua Fisher-Birch of the Counter-Extremism Project, he flagged the dark web represents another challenge that will have to be addressed in future. Beatrice Burton of the European Union Institute for Security Studies, she spoke of these new online safe havens, as did Nikita Malik back when she was at the Henry Jackson Society. She spoke of these hidden portions of the internet in a really great report about the dark web. And the team at Quilliam explained that these spaces, they actually cannot be located by basic search engines. They take pre-existing knowledge to find. So this felt like quite a significant blind spot. So we got to work building the Sulis AI platform to help overcome some of the obstacles that are typically associated with accessing and navigating the dark web. So when we talk about the dark web in the context of this project, what we mean right now specifically is the Tor network. And when researchers access and navigate the dark web, they typically face a host of ethical, technical, legal, and security obstacles. So just to give a couple of examples, just finding websites, let alone specific domains that are actually related to particular fields of investigation, that's a really time-intensive, really difficult process. It's also easy to stumble across malware and open yourself up to security threats. As we quickly learned, it's also easy to quickly come across highly abusive and even completely illegal content. So we built our tool to just start trying to overcome some of these obstacles. And in its first version, it offers users access to a safely and easily searchable repository, remote repository of dark web content by caching sources, stripping away all image content, and extracting text data from web pages. Okay. So we conducted an internal pilot project to test our platform and also see if we could use test codes to train a deep learning system detect different types of far-right content on the dark web. And we came across a wide spectrum of hate speech and other types of content. So I was talking with some of you earlier today about what it was like spending 4 months reading this type of content all day long. So just going to share some of that with you today. So the hate speech that we spent 4 months reading routinely targets Black, Indigenous, immigrant populations from around the world. One popular format that this takes is in a sort of news article style. So members of these communities who have committed or are just suspected of having committed various types of violent crime are singled out and featured in these articles. So if you were to read hundreds of these types of articles, like we did, if you were also to take them completely at face value, you'd of course get a completely skewed picture of who's actually committing violent crimes across the US, UK, Australia, and some other countries. We found derogatory speech targeted at women in general and specific women in the public eye is completely widespread and common. A lot of US-focused political content in particular is highly partisan. So prominent Democrat politicians and media figures are regularly named, criticized, also quite gratuitously insulted. But that being said, and there being that level of really heated debate and opinions is the better word, we actually didn't see as much explicit incitement to violence as we might have expected. So that's not to say we didn't see glorification of violence or individuals who have committed violent acts, but it was even stated in places that type of language won't be tolerated. And on that point, I think it's worth mentioning that these communities, they've actually now evolved in response to quite regular deplatforming by social media companies. So they've adapted their language to suit social media companies' terms of use, evade their content moderation efforts. And so just to give one example, they seem to sort of strategically deploy things like irony, sarcasm, humor, to open up this space also for plausible deniability, where they're able to say, oh, that thing we said, that was so clearly just a joke, wink, wink. I did want to also say that we didn't code this as a hate speech, but on a more random note, we were sort of surprised at the frequency with which vegans and veganism were targeted. That felt sort of random, but definitely a target. We came across a lot of conspiracy theory content given the community that we were looking at. It's not surprising to learn that a lot of the conspiracy theory content was anti-Semitic in nature. So generally just talking about global political, business, banking, media elites pulling strings and controlling events around the world, like the most recent presidential election in the US, like international coronavirus measures and shutdowns. We came across a lot of election misinformation, so some of this dating back years, but we really saw that spike around the election of Joe Biden last November, so in the before and after. We annoyingly ended our pilot project in the middle of November, which in hindsight is frustrating because it would have, of course, been really interesting to stay on top of what was happening in these spaces, what was being discussed in the run-up to and following the election, the event of January 6th, the Capitol Hill riots. But even around October, November, we were seeing a real ramping up of mobilization, of calling on members of this community to get out on the street, to make their dissent and voices heard, organizing basically around the Stop the Steal events that were being held at the time. We saw some coronavirus misinformation, so around 200 articles, generally framing international measures taken against the coronavirus as over the top, as exaggerated, as oppressive, while the virus was treated as harmless and an orchestrated hoax. We also saw some vaccine misinformation. This generally was about highlighting that vaccines are dangerous, they're suspicious, they've been insufficiently tested. Alongside all of that hate, all of that misinformation, which is really easy to get drawn into just focusing exclusively on, I think this is maybe a bit ironic following Akhil, but there were significant community building efforts. So there was this positive dynamic as well, where there's regular advertisements for radio shows, mention even of a book club, sharing of self-help resources, regular physical fitness and wellness tips and advice. So it's important to remember that members of this and other similar communities, they're being offered often a lot more than just hate, messages of hate and channels for their grievances. I was asked to also talk a bit about possible responses and would like to take the opportunity to highlight the work that's being done by the team at Moonshot, in particular in response to the threats emanating from far-right communities online. So when they compared pre-pandemic baselines to post-pandemic activities, they actually found that people online have been accessing hate content at significantly higher rates. And in the US, they've, across social media platforms, they've been running a number of crisis and de-escalation campaigns targeted at directly people engaging with extremist content online. And in testing various messaging approaches through these campaigns, they actually found that people were a lot more likely to engage with, to positively respond to non-ideological messaging. So as opposed to, I think this really touches on what Aaron was saying as well, as opposed to explicit counter-narratives, people were far more likely to be open to be receptive to engage with messages, for instance, offering psychosocial support, so mental health, self-help content. That was something people were much more positive about, much more likely to engage with, and that gels with what we found as well. From our side, we've been focused on building tools to support the researchers and practitioners on the front lines, save time and resources, get better data and insights, ultimately to help them develop more tailored and targeted responses and interventions. And on that note, as of last week, our tool offering safe and easy access to far-right content on the dark web is live. We're inviting researchers to trial the platform. So if that's interesting to you or someone you know, please do get in touch. And thank you.